task that was given by Bruce and Mark, which is to survey the field of digital pathology, it became very clear to me very quickly with the sort of exploding number of solutions and devices and workflow opportunities that would not be able to cover everything. So I picked selections really from across the industry that represent the contemporary state of the practice, and I'll also be able to make commentary about what we anticipate will be future technologies and solutions in the near term. I should be cautious to just, as a preface, say that, first of all, I'm not going to be covering any prices because those are highly fluid and subject to change in local negotiation. Also, they're difficult to come by in exact numbers. So I'm mostly interested in capability and workflow as represented by the devices themselves. And any mention of any particular product or solution absolutely does not constitute an endorsement. By way of disclosure, I'm a consultant with Aperio, which is a not Aperio, Inspirata, which is they used to be. Actually, disclosure, before they dissolved the advisory board, I was on Aperio's advisory board, but no longer. But I am the chair of the advisory board of Inspirata. But again, the products I'll be mentioning today are not that company. So just as some high-level observations, it's just very brief history of these devices. Really, it's been a very, very long journey to where we are now that we have our first FDA-approved device for primary certification, and anticipating perhaps as many as 3 by this coming year, followed by a survey of what I call the major solution providers, and then very briefly a discussion of data orchestration, which I think Liran would have perhaps in the RFP section, did you cover requiring data orchestration from your APLS vendors yesterday?
No details, just good.
No. So I'll mention just some additional details how this can be enabled, because the one time you can make this possible is at the time of purchase of an APLIS. And then very briefly, a survey of disruptive technologies that may impact the commercial market space. So scanning platforms in interview, they've evolved through at least 4 major generations. First commercial platform in 2001 was the Aperio T1. Turns out, though, that a European company, I think 3D Histech, had in Europe a solution available as early as 1996. So depending on which solution, which year, we're clearly 20 years into this. And in fact, my colleague and friend Tom Float had a working platform in 1988 based on parts he got from Newport Instruments. Hey, or you can see there. Newport Instruments is a small parts optical shop and sells optical benches. And literally, Tom had a device that would scan a slide in about 160 hours. and its segmentation seam artifact wasn't too bad either, but you could tell where the images were stitched together. So we've come a long way from that. Now we complain, right? If a 15 by 15 square millimeter area takes more than a minute, it's like, what are you doing? This is slow. Obviously, for high throughput workflow, that's essential. And so the things that really drive the comparison of devices, which are largely becoming commoditized, not completely, but that will be the case perhaps in 2-3 years' time, is scanning speed, which is expected to get faster and faster. Already it is really quite good. Image quality and batch scanning capacity. And an interesting aspect of image quality, which is at least previously somewhat underrepresented in the design phases, which is now being recognized, is not just the quality of the objective above, but the quality of the condenser below to match the numerical aperture of the objective. If those two are not matched, even if an objective has a theoretical numerical aperture, which equates to its resolution limit, you will not realize that limit in providing non-columnated light. So as a potential purchaser of systems, this sounds a bit geeky or technical, but it's important. Just because a stated resolution is made possible by the objective doesn't mean you're actually going to receive that. It's important to actually, if you can, request the point spread function from the manufacturer. Have they properly manufactured and assembled the optical column, including the light source, the condenser, so that you can realize maximum performance of the resolution possible. And then finally, as a third category of devices, the batch scanning capacity of an instrument, whether it's a single or small form factor or a larger form factor. And all these different attributes constitute opportunities in which an implementer of a whole slide and digital pathology workflow solution can tailor the requirements of a particular location to then the instrument, so the instrument is neither overutilized or underutilized. Obviously from a single piece workflow perspective in lean, and it's interesting to know we're kind of at ground zero globally for lean in pathology, which is the Henry Ford Health System, thanks to Drs. Zarvo and Tuthill. If you look at whole slide imaging, this is a perfect example in which the appropriate selection of a device allows you to convert from batch workflow, which is undesirable, to single piece workflow, which is desirable, or load balance workflow. So in other words, one really, really fast instrument may not be as useful as 5 or 6 intermediate speed instruments running in parallel. So absolute blazing speed is not the end all of the optimization of lab workflow. You have to basically look at your peak capacity, which comes out of histology, which in fact many histology labs have not evolved to single piece workflow in a continuous workflow fashion, because we have some remaining bottlenecks. So I hate to go in the weeds for workflow for digital pathology, but it's important because it drives how we select these devices. And that one remaining bottleneck, or at least one of the remaining bottlenecks in histology in the pre-analytical phase, is the tissue processor. We have devices like the Polaris that have multiple retorts. That's a good start, but to my knowledge, and somebody in this room raise their hand if I'm wrong, I don't believe there's a device yet where you can single piece load an unprocessed cassette on a device and then it goes through like in assembly line fashion and comes out in real time. Does that device exist yet? No.
In cytology it exists. There's a salient cell block. In 1 hour you can do it in cytology, one specimen at a time.
That's great. So so you basically, when you load it, you can expect the block out within an hour. And you can load it randomly if it has additional input capacity.
You only do one at a time.
Oh, only one at a time.
Yeah. 8 a day.
Little asterisk there, right?
Yeah.
So if I wanted to do like 800 blocks, I need 800 instruments. Okay. It's a good sales model though, right? Okay. Getting back on track here. Contemporary scanners, while far superior to what Tom Float did 30 years ago, still have opportunities for improvement. I mentioned already the point spread function. Now you know what that means. It's basically maximizing the light and resolution capturing capacity of the objectives, front lenses. Scan to view latency. So yeah, the scan may take 45 seconds or 60 seconds, but then it goes through some type of dedicated connector or network connector to a server with some software, possibly some post-scanning processing. And so another question to ask is how long does it take from the time it's scanned to you, the pathologist or the quality review person, are physically reviewing that digital image, that latency. And sometimes the latency is quite minimal, just seconds, or sometimes it can add a minute or more. And that needs to be factored in to what I would call is the actual scan to view time, not just the scan time, but all of it before you're looking at an image. Another aspect is capture of additional optical modes. So Z-stack, fluorescence, phase contrast, polarization, hyperspectral, just to name a few. Every year there's 5 or 6 new types of optical excitation technologies that are percolating. It's impossible to deploy all of these in the clinical sense, but another number of them are useful. For example, when we're looking for crystals, we use polarization routinely, yet that's not necessarily a routine aspect of devices. So if we're trying to go, for example, to all digital workflow and rely on these instruments entirely, theoretically at least one of the instruments in our scan bank should be apportioned with that specialized type of visualization that would allow us then not to have to say, oh, this is a case for gout, let me pull out my microscope. And I mean, if you look at like Alexei Baidashvili's experience at LabCon, they're nearly 100%, and that's good. And the pathologists have got used to reading even the more difficult, like the neuropathology cases digitally. But there are certain modalities for which, for example, polarization, if you don't have the media in the digital fashion, you're really compelled to say, okay, I'm going to pull the microscope out. So the microscope isn't going away completely for the time being. I mean, maybe some of you would argue with me, but I think we're going to be having microscopes for a while, and that's okay, because if we switched over our workflow 95, 98, 99% to digital workflow. That's still arguably single piece workflow, and the number of times a day you'll be disrupted to use a microscope will be minimal. And in fact, if you know a priori you have like a service that's looking for gout crystals or other types of things requiring polarization, those can be segmented off up front. And so that type of manual workflow itself can be single piece using the older parlance. And in fact, based on volumes from that might inform us the type of specialized device, which would probably be a low volume scanning device, but appointed with the appropriate polarization technology, for example, so that too could eventually become digital. Again, it's a matter of identifying these niche and individual workflow conditions and then applying rational technology solutions as they become mature. And then finally, it's worth mentioning that workflow is paramount, and really the automation of workflow and making a digital whole slide system effective. And that means looking at the pre-analytical steps as well as the analytical and post-analytical. And this ties into things like barcode-driven workflow, which I assume was already covered yesterday, as well as then is optimizing the lean process, the conveyance within the laboratory, so lean methods, doing spaghetti maps of people walking around, minimizing the conveyance of physical assets, such as slides and blocks. And then finally, this all-important point, which is difficult for many, and remains difficult for many, certainly for us at U of M, is integration with the AP-LIS systems. And the reason this is potentially challenging is if we envision a cockpit where the pathologist literally has all the information presented to them. So not just the digital images, but the pathology data, and then all aspects of the clinical history. And then in tandem with that, all tools needed to assemble a complete surgical pathology report and sign it out from that location. The reason that's important is it allows the possibility of not breaking workflow. If you have to use one system, then log into another system, let's say the EHR, to look at medications, look up other eventualities, problem list, the recent medical history, and then go back to your context. That death of 1,000 cuts, we've done time motion studies, other people have done time motion studies, takes what could theoretically be a 45-second operation and makes it 5 minutes or 10 minutes. As just a parenthetical aside, I'm working with my colleague, David McClintock, right now on a project to automate SPEPs. You'd think that's a mundane thing, except the volumes of mushrooms. Same problem. The instrument is not interfaced. The pathologist looks at the waveform of the SPEP, then goes to the EHR to see if any patient's on monoclonal or a biologic therapy, which would be a cause of a spike, which is an actual disease process. That disruption takes 8.5 minutes on average. So what would normally be about 20 minutes of sign out now is 3 hours, and that's unsustainable. If we look at also the idea of digital pathology sign out using this new construct, as opposed to a microscope, or just interacting with the AP-LIS workflow, you have a significant delay. So again, these platforms that I'm going to be reviewing just now, don't look at them in the microcosm of just a device that generates images. It's important to look at their potential, and that's from a vendor perspective, of providing integrative tools with your existing AP-LIS so you have an immersive solution. And I should caution you that when you do that, you're going to find it's not the whole slide scanners that create the impasse. They're tremendously interested in facilitating workflow. Ironically, it's the established cohort of AP-LIS vendors. How many people in this room from vendor side are AP-LIS vendors?
I'm representing.
I won't pick on you, but till the end. But the challenge is getting the AP-LIS vendors to offer orchestration, and that's where I'll.
Well, is that a financial challenge? Is it a political challenge? Why do you think that they've been shy or?
It's a turf battle. I mean, quite putting it bluntly, the AP-LIS vendors feel that they own the sign-out workspace. In other words, if you're going to do something and hit sign out, they own that. So you see the problem, if you have now a cockpit which is made by a third party or made by the scanning manufacturer, in order to make a completely immersive environment, You've assembled this beautiful case. It just needs data orchestration at the database level, which we know how to do this. It can be done, and all the APLIS vendors use modern databases. It can be done. It's not a question of possibilities, it's a question of business choices. And so far, the vendors by and large have dug their heels in and said, we're not gonna offer the connectivity to that part of our database. You must sign out the case from within our commercial system. That's a major disconnect. So that's one of the remaining challenges in addition to the appliance. So when you look at a whole slide scanning solution and you're just looking at the aspect of acquiring images, that's great, that's certainly necessary, but you're not done. That's just the beginning of creating a complete solution for digital pathology workflow. And I would offer to you that in the end, final analysis, we're gonna look at the difficulties we had to arrive to this point of having quality scanned images, and that's gonna be relatively trivial compared to the data orchestration problem. Because while we don't even have data orchestration right now, what's happening is, because of precision medicine, the level of complexity of our reports is going up, up, and up. And without data orchestration now, the difficulty level, even if in our core AP systems to generate reports, is going up. So it takes more time and more effort to make reports versus purpose-built systems that do this very, very elegantly. So I would make an offer to you, one final prediction. And I know this prediction is probably correct, at least for some places, because we've decided to do this at U of M, so it's gonna happen at least one place, which we've given up on our APLIS vendor, in essence. I mean, we're gonna continue using it for pre-analytical and analytical, and when we generate a report in a standalone system, whatever that system may be, that's going straight into the EMR. We're gonna control that last mile. We've lost control from the APLISs. And the hope is when we have that example, the APLIS community will wake up and say, no, we need to work with you all. I expect that'll happen, but there's gonna be a contentious journey reaching that point.
This isn't unique to pathology.
No, of course
Right,
not.
so the radiologist, you can turn the argument, they can't do this either. And the oncologist can't even use their EMR that has all the data to give an EMR specific view. So as the complexity of healthcare has grown, any of the systems.
No, absolutely. But our complexity has hit a level that the sentiment, at least in our team's perspective, is we've had enough and we're not gonna take it anymore. And we happen to have an IT development shop, so you put the two together, we'll build it. Now, so that being said, generally, as a general rule, building something yourself is a really, really bad idea. So if you're going to build it, the next step, of course, is finding a partner in which to transition that so it becomes vendor supported. So I'm not advocating for homegrown because that has all its challenges. Okay, switching gears. So just as a kickoff, using one example to one of the earlier adopters, company all the way back from 1996, European company, turnkey solutions, whole slide scanning. They also have pretty good expertise in tissue microarrays. I build entire software packages and hardware assembly packages for microarrays. Is there anybody in here from 3D? Well, anyway, again, I have no financial stake in any of these companies. I'm just doing a potpourri of what is interesting. And they have workflow solutions, digital pathology, frozen section, gross examination. And in point of fact, most of the vendors I'll be covering in this field do all these things. This is just one example, including the more recent development of remote consultation, which is very elegant because now you're not just looking at images, you're using tools provided by the vendor to sign out a case. Here you hit that wall, right? If you have this report that's very elegant, how do you get it back into your local APLIS? Well, you have to possibly cut and paste and then re-sign it out. It's not exactly a sustainable interface. And then finally, tumor board modules. So companies like this are really the benchmark of offering not just appliances, but appliances as well as software solutions and pre-analytical preparative solutions, for example, making tissue microarrays. So the panoramic desk 2, for example, would be an example of a low-level, low-volume, single-slide scanner. Often we'll see as a technology platform, what vendors will do is they'll choose a single objective, like a 20, and then they'll double it with an internal optical piece. In this case, we have an interesting selection of a 41x objective with additional 20x, 26x and 90x options, which can be manually interchanged. This particular scanner is interesting because it has a DW or double wide capability. So for like prostate hole mounts, for example, you can use this scanner, which is really a personal scanner, or low volume, you put like in a frozen section area, or low volume console source location, where you can scan both regular slides and wide slides. And at 90-second scan time for such a small device, at the 15 by 15 millimeter standard resolution, that's actually not bad for something even as aggressive as frozen section workflow support. Adding another 90 seconds in the overall triage loop is tolerable. And how do we know that? We know that from Dr. Andy Evans, who's been doing this now for 7 years in Toronto. That added minute and a half washes out in the overall scheme of the delivery of the specimen from the OR to the pathology suite and other analytics of just getting the surgeon back on the intercom to let them know the findings. This device doesn't have fluorescent capability, does not have stacking yet, and does require an external PC. So again, one thing to consider of any of these devices, when looking at your footprint, it's not just the device itself, but the device and a large or small form factor PC. Do you need a large monitor, small monitor? Some devices, generally the much more sophisticated devices, will have a much more aggressive requirement for footprint with externally attached computer. But at the same token, very high throughput devices also have incorporated like a touch screen and a display panel for interacting with them. So you have really both things going on. The irony is, even with a self-contained instrument that has the interactive touch screen, you still may need a computer to access the more nuanced aspects of the software. However, there's a whole set of a generation of machines that haven't been formally announced that probably will in the next year or so from a number of manufacturers that really will be self-contained turnkey systems. So the fifth generation of devices really quite transformative. The panoramic mini is another example. Intermediate, still low volume, but a little higher, 12 slides. So this might be, for example, in a practice where if you have your core surgical pathology operations, and then you have a circuit rider pathologist. An example we have is we have one pathologist that goes out to East Ann Arbor every day rotating, and that pathologist does two things. They're on standby for local cases, local breast biopsies, and they try sending out cases centrally that get shipped to them because we're not using digital pathology yet, but we will be. So the opportunity here is if that individual needs a consultation, and the volume is a little bit higher because multiple biopsies come down to 1 or 2, this intermediate volume is perfect for a remote circuit rider pathologist that has as a use case sharing a larger set of slides. And this can scan enough slides in a short period of time that would allow for easy intramural practice consultations. Interestingly, it has an option for fluorescence, which makes it potentially useful for dermatopathology consultation as well, or renal for that matter. Both of those subspecialties making use of fluorescence imaging. And again, the same internal scan engine, 90 seconds at 26x, which equates to a slightly longer time if you go to the requirement for 40x. Interestingly, just as a parenthetical aside, if you have a high numerical aperture 20, where the numerical aperture is typically above 0.75, and you put an optical doubler in it, the numerical information present in that original image is sufficient to allow for quarter micron pixels, which is essentially the standard of what you'd expect from a 40x objective. So just because a scanner says its base objective is 20x, you really need to look at the full story of its implementation to find out if that 20x and doubled 40x is inferior to a native 40x scanner. In many cases, it will be slightly inferior, but there are exclusive or specific configurations in which the optical engineers have chosen objectives to actually preserve the quarter micron resolution equivalent by going to a doubler. And that's elegant because then you have a relatively quick way of switching between the 20 and the 40 at lower expense to the manufacturer. Similarly, you can have an internal turret system that switches objectives and have just the old-fashioned a 20x and a 40x and maybe some other objectives as well. And this device is a standard slide format capability, has fluorescence, and it requires an external PC, because you can see in the device it has no built-in touchscreen or status monitor. Another example of an intermediate device, this is a 150 slide scanner from 3D Histech. And it has, again, an optional 90x on the bright field. This is a 90 dry. So it approaches the potential use case for hematopathology, although having worked with a number of hematopathologists at MGH, like for example, Dr. Nancy Harris, they would not prefer to use a dry 90, they would use an oil 100. So, and I think you do some hematopathology in your day. So, this is still out, the jury hasn't come back in on whether you can do hematopathology on a dry objective. There's also, I think, somewhere offered at, I think, is it Nikon, offers a 98 or 99 dry, 100x 99 numerical aperture dry, which is a bit cloudy. Again, the air-based interfaces will never provide the same resolution as an oil objective, which is a challenge. And then finally, going to larger instruments, the panoramic 250 Flash 2, we consider this a high volume intermediate speed 250 slide scanner. You would have this in a central histology operation. This can handle reasonably good volume at its speed of 36 seconds at 26x or 90 seconds at 40x. But that, I would still say, because of the more than a minute at 40x, I'm still calling that intermediate speed. So to be high speed would be typically now 45 seconds or less at 40x. And that's really hard to do with the contemporary generation, of third and fourth generation. The fifth generation scanners, which are about to come out, will actually deliver on that promise of 45 seconds or less on the 40x scan. But then the question you have to ask is, okay, it's scanned it in 45 seconds. How long does it take till I can look at it? What is the computational latency? You really have to add that, because that's when the data is really available. And this is a fluorescent capable device without Z-stacking, needs an external PC. And the Flash 3, another high volume, high speed device. Now we can see we've broken or almost broken the 1 minute limit, 20 seconds for 26x, 60 seconds for 40x. You can see with each successive generation how the numbers keep dialing down. The devices keep getting faster and faster and more options. So this device is a 52x bright field option and a 20, 32, and 64x for fluorescence with floor grade objectives. And it has no Z-stacking, but it still, again, requires an external PC. So the footprint of this device needs to be factored in with the accompanying PC. And then there are other systems that have just been recently announced, the Panoramic 1000, for example, which is has, interestingly, water and oil immersion capability built in. I haven't explored yet how they clean the objective. Maybe they're using multiple objectives.
Very small person.
Yeah. Elven technology. And it's basically considered a 100 slide per hour type device. There's additionally a confocal device, which is really for more research specialty labs, and then the MIDI 2, which is a small, low form factor device. Just to show you, these devices from manufacturers are just mushrooming, and they're doing so to fit individual niche circumstances for workflow. One thing that should be mentioned, however, just because you get a single high throughput scanner for your central histology lab, you are absolutely not done. As high reliability as these devices have become, I mean, their downtime really is quite low. It's not zero. And so if you have a high throughput lab that you've already picked two to load balance and cover your volume, you probably still need on premises a hot spare. And that's an interesting opportunity where you can negotiate with your vendor. Maybe you don't actually purchase that third. It's just stored on premises as a spare part, a spare device. And that allows them to realize a service level agreement that if a device goes down, it'll be back up in 30 minutes. Obviously, you can't do that in the setting of having somebody coming in and having to ship in a replacement device. So there are creative ways, potentially, when vendors willing to work with you, to get an additional device which represents a hot spare without actually purchasing that device. So And one way that that works is, of course, if you can get that arrangement as an offer and a quote from one vendor, then you can use that as leverage with your other vendors. So for the vendors in the room, I'm sorry I'm sort of disclosing this secret, but there are no pathologists in the room, and this is, of course, for the benefit of the user community. This is an effective strategy in getting appropriate load capacity. Similarly, you may just choose to say, we're gonna buy 2 machines and have 2 additional machines, which represent 2 things. They're the backup units if the primaries fail, and we're gonna use them anyway in times of high load for overflow capacity, and that's valid as well. Again, switching gears, Hamamatsu, another company that has deep knowledge in both the mechanical and physical aspects of superb optical design, as well as the capture technology of the CCDs that generate images. So this company really understands, even though they weren't in originally the digital pathology space, by virtue of what they do in optics and image capture, they have deep expertise in every aspect of the robotics and physics needed to build a superb whole slide scanner. So for their entry-level device, it's a low volume, low speed, single slide scanner. This would be, for example, something maybe a pathologist would have on their desk or in a remote outlying location that does an occasional frozen or has an occasional consult. Where you're willing to wait a minute or 2 to send it in. You can see that it has a limited form factor, just a 1x3 inch slide capacity. It's relatively slow, that's why I'm calling it low volume, low speed. 150 seconds at 20x, 275 at 40x. No fluorescence, but it does have the ability to do localized Z-stacks, which could be useful for cytopathology. So this is a very flexible, small form factor device. And of course it needs an external PC, given its small form factor. Many of you have seen this device, the NanoZoomer S60. This is an intermediate volume, intermediate speed, because the volume and speed go up. 30 slide capacity. This will also do the larger, for example, whole mount prostate 2x3 inch as an option. Has very good numerical aperture specs on its objectives, 0.23 micron at 40 and 0.46 at 20. This is really industry standard. Actually, industry standard is 1/4 micron, so it's ever so slightly better, but perfectly acceptable, diagnostic quality. And the scan time at 20 is a little faster at 60 and 150 at 40x. And it has an option for fluorescence capability and true Z stacking. A perfectly solid contender in the central histology lab scanning for a lower volume central histology solution. And again, you'd never want to put one of these in place. It'd always be 2 or more. And if your volume requires 2, again, you're going to do n plus 1 or n plus 2 to account for the redundancy capability. Am I going too fast? Is this about the right?
Keep going, keep going.
So the S210, very similar to the other device, but just higher volume. It's got a 210 slide scanner, same numerical resolution issues, 60 and 150 seconds for 20 and 40x respectively. And again, that needs an external PC. The XR, again, we've gone now to 320 slides. So you can see really dialing in the same engine with different slide handling capabilities. This is really, though, more of a high volume, high speed device, because you can see now the scan time for 20 and 40 respectively is 35 and 45 seconds. So as a 4th generation device, we're getting pretty fast here. This is a beefy device appropriate for a higher volume community-based hospital or academic hospital, where your number of slides you generate, for example, are 3,000 or 4,000 slides a day. A few of these would be able to tackle that volume for all digital workflow. Huron, a very interesting company, because not only do they make conventional optics, we have somebody, we have people from Huron in the room, do we? No? Oh, anyway, the reason this is a really unique company is they build their own optics, which usually other companies OEM them from other optical suppliers, and that allows them to build really unique configurations. So as soon as we get to the larger units, they have scan form factor sizes that the other vendors don't. So that maybe is more boutique to researchers trying to scan large things like whole brain sections, but I included here for completeness. So their low volume entry device, the Tissue Scope PE, the desktop unit, it's got the expected 0.25 and 0.5 micron at 40 and 20x. It's a 1x3 inch, and it has as an option the 2x3 inch. It's slow, 300 plus seconds. This is a personal unit. It has no fluorescence and no Z-stacking. This is something you would have on your desk if you want a nice teaching case and you brought the slide back and you just want to have, a scan generated. But the quality of the scans it generates are quite good. The tissue scope LE, a little bit higher volume. This is like a 12-slide scanner. Very similar to what I described as the circuit writer pathologist off-site, periodically having to send in a small batch of cases. This would fit that need exactly. It has the added unique feature because it has this large tray or different types of trays that support different form factors. And this ties in again to the unique optics that Huron can manufacture. It can do 2x3, 3x4, 4x5, 5x7, 6.8. I mean, I've never been in a pathology department that generates 6x8 slides, but some neuropath research places do that. A very flexible device from that perspective, and of course with the 300 plus second slow throughput. So you're not going to be using this really for anything other than educational research. It doesn't have a sufficient throughput. CF, it's basically the last device, look in red, with the added fluorescence capability. Same scan engine, very useful research device. Might be useful for intermediate volume dermatopathology or kidney pathology, perhaps. Here's a more beefy device, the LE120. Again, it carries forward the unique optics, so you can have all these different sizes, which is quite flexible. But it has the 120 slide scanner. So this is a strange device. It's an intermediate volume, intermediate to high volume, low speed scanner. So I don't know if you'd use that clinically because you're not going to wait 300 seconds plus per slide, but I guess if you're a large scale research operation, you've got lots of research cases that can wait, and you don't want to manually load them, this would be perfect. It has no fluorescent capability. I think that can be added as a feature. So this is kind of in a strange niche in that it's high volume, low speed. I don't think many of us need that. Switching now, Leica Perio CS2. There are of course a whole series of Leica instruments evolving to the present. I won't go through those. I'm just going to cover the three current ones. Leica, amongst many others, is coming out with new devices. This is a 5-slide scanner, standard resolution capability of its pixels, 100-second and 300-second scan time, no fluorescence, but it does have Z-stack. Solid contender for a low volume application. As far as the low volume devices go, it does have somewhat larger footprint than some of the other low volume devices, so that is a consideration, and it requires a PC. Leica Perio FL, it's a bit faster, 100, 300 seconds, has fluorescence capability. However, you have to be very careful in precisely specifying the dichroic and interference filters so that, if those are fixed in its optical pathways, so that they're compatible with the fluorescence signal and detection system that you're using. And it has Z-stack capability, which is fascinating with fluorescence. It's another solid contender. And it's a 20x device that generates 2x DO40. However, this is where you have to be careful. If you ask what the equivalent numerical aperture is, you find out you're getting empty magnification. It's not a true 40 in this case. Some instruments it is. In this case, it sort of looks like a 40, but it's more like a mushy 40. So, not good.
Mushy. It's interpolating pixels.
AT2, this is kind of the current workhorse, 400 slide scanner, 1 slide scanner with a manual load for the 2x3 slide, industry standard pixel resolution, pretty good scan time at 20, 60 seconds, 155 second scan at 40. So I call this still intermediate speed, not high speed, because it's more than a minute at the 40x. And it has an attribute of having very solid robotics for not jamming up often. So it's truly a walk-away turnkey system. The earlier generations of this, not so much, but they put lots and lots of effort over the years to the point that the sensors, the robotics, the self-calibration truly make it a walk-away system. And I should say that's really the case for all the vendors' current offerings of high-throughput devices. The slide handling issues have largely been corrected with the perhaps one exception of per mount getting on the objective. If you don't have a dry slide, there's no machine that I know that cleans itself. That's going to be a timeout to go in and clean the objective. And you can see it as an inset what the loading looks like with these various baskets, which are modular. In fact, most of the high throughput devices now make use of modular technology. The Microscan SL5, I just mentioned for completeness, one of these smaller form factor devices. It has multiple objectives though built in, which makes it kind of more flexible. And no fluorescence, no Z stacking. But the multiple objectives means more flexibility for the images you capture. The Modic Easy Scan, again, one of these personal 6-slide devices, relatively straightforward, good resolution. The Pro increases the resolution by using a high numerical aperture 20x. So you have same exact engine, better quality images. Objective Imaging Glissando, one of these small personal devices. But here's interesting, it's a personal device, low volume, intermediate speed. We're seeing more of that. And I predict within 2 years, we'll have a low volume like personal device that will be high speed. So keep looking, follow this company. This company may be poised to generate a high-speed personal device, which, who doesn't want to have a fast personal scanner? And of course, finally, rounding things out, the Philips UFS 300-slide, quarter-micron resolution, random access cassette system. And just cutting to the chase, the bottom line, it's right now the current only primary diagnosis FDA-cleared complete pixel pipeline. So you get the scanner, the servers, even the monitors are all part of that current FDA-cleared solution, which perhaps can be a little bit constraining, but I know that Philips is working to create a solution by which one does not necessarily need to purchase that specific monitor. That's the way the FDA made them apply under the de novo pathway, and so they did. But once a user buys their solution, there's nothing to stop you from validating an off-label second monitor, or in point of fact, it may be the case that Philips will be offering, and we have somebody from Philips in the room might be able to comment, you may be offering another set of monitors, right, than the one the FDA has stipulated in time?
Yes, that is in the pipeline.
Exactly. And then the Roche Ventana iScan Choreo, a high volume, now here's another low speed scanner. I think these, quality is superb. The speed's got to come up, and in point of fact, we know that there are generations of devices coming from multiple vendors, including this vendor, which will address that slight deficiency. Nothing wrong with this device other than slightly slower scan speed. The Ventana iScan HT, which again, this is still not their fastest. There's new stuff coming out very likely, but this is definitely a high-speed scanner, or right at the border, which being 72 seconds, right at that 1 minute threshold. No Z-stack or fluorescence capability, however, but with 360 slides, it's legitimately a high throughput device. And in point of fact, the FDA cleared diagnostic software that accompanies it for example, quantitative immunohistochemistry, and that also accompanies iScan Choreo, makes these attractive platforms for doing quantitative immunohistochemistry, for which you can bill incrementally, of course. And then rounding things out, the Secure Vision Tech, low volume, low speed, 4-slide scanner. Again, it's more of a personal device, relatively slow at 40x, more than 400 seconds. And the Vision Tech M6, 360 seconds at 40x. But it has multiple objectives, and they're Carl Zeiss objectives. So for a small device, the image quality that this model generates is superb. So some final comments. I mentioned already about data orchestration. The reality is, once we generate the images, we're going to put them in place in a diagnostic cockpit, along with supporting clinical evidence and other pathology evidence like the former prior cases. And what we really need is a tool by which we can generate reports quickly. The challenge isn't building such tools. The challenge is integrating those into the existing AP-LIS workflow. And not to belabor the point, because Liren already covered the issue of the RFE process, but I'll just mention that this orchestration needs to be woven into the fabric of the RFP. Bruce?
Could you define orchestration? Is it different from integration?
It is, because so integration would be like a federated query. I'm the cockpit, I want to get the clinical medications, the problem list, and the most recent progress notes. That's a federated query back to the EHR. That's just transactional database. An orchestration is where you're actuating a foreign system. So, okay, I'm in the cockpit, I've reviewed this perfectly good surgical pathology report, I want to sign it out. I want to hit the sign out button which then orchestrates a command to the APLIS that says, here's the case, take it, and then sign it out. And that orchestration piece of sending a command to a downstream system is not available currently, in most cases. And that type of orchestration where one system is essentially operating another system, that is the level of interconnectivity we will need to create data cockpits. We don't have that right now. And so the leverage is at the time of system purchase. I'm good. So this is my last slide.
Awesome.
So deep learning, so about disruptive technologies, deep learning and image analytics, which will be embedded into the DNA of image cockpits, will forever change the way pathologists carry out their practice. We will switch in the next 10 years from review and screening of material to directed review, which is safer and faster and will let us operate at our highest credential level. Many pathologists will have the knee-jerk response, oh, you're going to replace me with a computer. No, there's no computer that I can see in the foreseeable future that will be able to exert the medical judgment that a physician will in tying in all aspects of the case. But will the day-to-day activities that we do as pathologists change? Absolutely. And we should just recognize that this is the nature of the evolution of the practice. This has happened in radiology, or is happening in radiology. It will happen to us. It's not a bad thing. If anything, it will allow us to address the potential significant pathology staffing shortage in the next 2 decades by use of these tools, which will scale our expertise to higher volume. And the scan solutions and workflow solutions are only the entry steps to this long succession of automation that we see in AP. We've had, of course, all the automation over the past decade. In CP, that's 2 decades. Now AP is slowly going to follow suit. And this is actually coming sooner than you think. Thanks.
Wow, that was great. Sorry I had to walk out for a couple of minutes. I needed to walk upstairs to make sure that the lab wasn't on fire or anything. So you'll, in the nature of time, we have about half an hour for questions after the vendor section. So if we can defer questions till then, is that okay?
Perfect.
Okay.